Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. T'Pring Michelle Piquato, Executive Director for NSPN, and it is my pleasure to have our guests round out our web series this week. We are going to be talking about how your science, your endeavors should be presented and broadened and be able to have a participatory nature in an open science way. Our guests are from open science. That's what they specialize in. That's what they're going to be talking about. So thank you so much for joining us. I know we spoke a couple of months back, and I was so excited to have you join this particular webinar series. So it was sort of designed around you. Our first 3 days, we're talking about local participation, how you can sort of participate, but our audience are early career stage researchers primarily. And I'm going to pass it to you guys to introduce yourselves. We want to be you when you grow up. So help us understand your background and share how you envision us getting out our research to a broader community and why it's so important.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm going to share my screen and hopefully that works. There we go. And we can dig in. Erin and I are really quite excited to be here today and talking to you all. Erin and I co-run the Open Research Community Accelerator, which is a nonprofit that really aspires to nurture cross-sector coalitions to tackle the systems level challenges that are impeding the adoption of open science at scale. And we'll talk about what open science is and why that matters and how it's relevant from a policy perspective. But as you can see on the screen, really what we aspire to is a world in which science is more engaging and more accessible and more actionable for policymakers, for communities, for patients, for practitioners, et cetera, and so forth. And so we'll explain, like I said, how we think this is relevant to your work, and then have lots of time for conversation as we go along. So first of all, what is open science? What is open research? What is open data? My screen is maybe not fully maximized, but it's the best I can do. So hopefully it's legible. Apologies if it's not perfectly optimized. We're going to switch back and forth between terms a little bit here, and I apologize for if I'm sort of switching in a way that is unintentionally confusing. But when we think about open science, it's really an encompassing term that is meant to describe both research processes and outcomes that are more inclusive and efficient, transparent, and trustworthy than how science is traditionally conducted and how it's traditionally disseminated. And we'll talk about the ramifications of that as we go along. Just in terms of a definition and how we think about open really means that anyone can freely access, use, modify, and share for any purpose the science, right? So the idea is this is created in a way that is not meant to be siloed. It's not meant to be held closely so that individual value can be extracted to its fullest. It's the idea that science and knowledge is a public good and can really be used to the benefit of not just science, but society if we're intentional about our design. And obviously the ramifications for policy are pretty dramatic as we'll go through. I'm going to pass it to Erin to just talk a little bit about why different organizations, different entities are increasingly leaning into the concept of open science, how it furthers their missions and their values. And then we'll talk with some granularity, some specificity about, from a policy perspective, the ramifications of that trend line. So I'll turn to Erin.
Super. Thanks, Greg. Good morning, everyone. So I am Erin McKiernan. I'm the Director of Programs and Strategies for ORCA. So really excited to be here with you all. Yeah, and as Greg said, a lot of organizations are leaning into open science, especially over the last few years. We've seen a growing trend. And one of those organizations is UNESCO. So this comes from UNESCO as they were building their recommendation in open science. They really wanted it to be more than just the academic piece. So how is it that open science can connect with society, fulfill society needs, promote kind of equal opportunities for not just scientists that are doing the actual science, but also policymakers and citizens and, the general public. So they really do believe that open science is this key enabling strategy that can be, as you see there, a game changer in fulfilling the human right to science that they believe in very strongly. And so do we, and bridging kind of those science, technology, and innovation gaps that we're seeing both between and within countries. And if we go to the next slide, we can see how UNESCO has kind of outlined this. So they were really intentional about saying open science comes or is driven by kind of a set of values and principles. And some of those values include, quality and integrity of the work. If we're sharing it out in the open, we can see how well it was done, how rigorously it was done. Collective benefit of that science, if it's shared more broadly, it can impact more folks. Equity and fairness, especially in terms of the voices that are heard and the perspectives that are incorporated into the scientific process, and then diversity, inclusiveness as well, kind of bringing in more voices, bringing in the community as well. So as you can see, there's a set of principles there, but all of this kind of revolves around the idea that if we're being transparent, if we're being, open with our science, then that leads into equality, diversity, collaboration, participation, all of these good things that we would like to see. And so, kind of pushing a little bit more on this, why do we want to open up scholarship? It's not open for the sake of being open, but really about what openness can enable us to do. And so you can see just a few examples there of kind of this idea of open in order to do what. We really do believe strongly, and I think there is growing evidence, some of which we'll talk about today, that openness can stimulate innovation, accelerate discovery, facilitate collaboration, and especially kind of some of these pieces we want to talk about, encourage citizen science, encourage community engagement, and really get the public involved in what science is and what it can do for society. And I think there I'm going to hand it to Greg to talk a little bit about different components of open science, and one of those is open access to the literature.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. And that's right. So open science, open scholarship, open research, using those terms relatively interchangeably, that's an umbrella that houses a specific set of activities. And one of them is open access. So open access to the literature, scholarly articles, journal articles, book chapters, conference proceedings. The idea is that traditionally those have been held behind paywalls. They're published in journals, and there is a subscription toll to those journals. And either you as an individual or as a member of an institution, you're paying and you get access. And if you don't pay, you don't get access. Obviously, and that model, by the way, publishing in peer-reviewed journals, that came to be in 1665, right? So it's a long-standing tradition. With the internet, the idea that you have to go to the library to photocopy a copy of an article, well, that was just silly, right? All these things are available in PDF or HTML. Everyone should be able to access them, with very minimal barriers. And so this created this idea of open access to literature, free availability to read and to reuse this content without barriers, right? Knowledge as a human right. And this matters because even today, so even with technology and the distribution costs being, the model being so different than it was in the 17th century, half the literature is still behind a paywall. You still have to pay to get access to it, and that's more than 1 million papers every year. That if you want to learn, if you want to read about a specific condition or promising treatment or ways to potentially arrest climate change, that literature, it's a coin flip whether it's going to be accessible to you or not. More than 2,700 papers every day are getting published that are behind these paywalls. And that has ramifications, right? It has ramifications, as I said, if you or a loved one has a disease, and there's a new drug protocol that you want to share with your doctor. It's hard to do that if you don't have access to the papers. It's the same if you're in a community that's affected, as we all seem to be, by climate change, and we want to think about possible solutions and modeling and so forth. We'd like to be able to get access to that literature. It matters in the classroom. It matters if you're a researcher at an institution that is not a major research intensive institution. You don't have access to all the literature. You just don't, because there's too much of it and it's too expensive to have access. It matters when we report what's happening in the world. If those news reporters don't have access to the facts. And it matters, of course, from a policymaking perspective as well. We want our policies to be evidence-based, evidence-driven, but it's hard to do that if you can't get your hands on the science and on the data, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So, like I was saying, this affects policy, right? There are any number of anecdotal and data-driven examples about the ways in which access to scientific and scholarly literature can affect public policy, both positively and negatively. At a high level, I think it's fairly easy to imagine that policymakers are inclined to rely on evidence to formulate legislation and regulations and governmental strategy, that they can more easily do that if they actually have access to that information, right? The through line there is fairly obvious to see. The Lancet, which is one of the more esteemed titles in scholarly publishing, has recognized this by making policy and spatial indicators for urban design and transport from 24 cities across 6 continents freely available, so that municipalities can evaluate their own policies and see what's working and index on that. And that series has been practically used. We know it's been used by cities and townships around the world to help create or contribute to healthy and sustainable cities. There's another of other examples on the page, and we can obviously provide links and so forth, but I do want to talk specifically about one of them, which is the New York Times opinion that says, yes, we were warned about Ebola. This is sort of arguing the inverse, right? So in 1982, the Annals of Virology published a paper showing how Liberia has a highly endemic potential for Ebola, and warned that health authorities should be aware that there was this potential risk of outbreak. That journal that it was published in, Annals of Virology, is behind the paywall. It's subscription only. And even when, so that was in 1982, but even when the back files were digitized and made available on the internet, they still weren't made openly available. And that had real ramifications, right? There were not folks in Liberia. We know this. There were not libraries, there were not institutions in Liberia that had access to this literature. In 2014, there was an epidemic of Ebola that impacted the country. Local public health experts were caught relatively flat-footed, and that had obviously very, very serious ramifications. So this is not an abstraction, right? It's not just, oh, if we make this information available, maybe folks will read it, maybe it'll help them make better decisions in public policy. There are real ramifications, and we know that both, again, on the affirmative and on the negative. And it's not just about papers, right? It's about data too, and I can pass to Erin to talk about this section.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Yeah, so as Greg mentioned, one problem is the access to the papers themselves, but another thing is the data underlying those studies. So one component that is really important about open science is what we call open data or data sharing. And that again means that data are accessible to anyone to not just see, but also use and reuse and remix and share and build upon in different ways. And this is a quote, I believe, from the European Union. They're talking about how governments and businesses and individuals can use open data to bring about social, economic, and environmental benefits. If we look at the scope of the problem on the next slide, we can see that this is a serious problem. So some folks who don't necessarily do science might not realize that the data behind these papers are not available. This study went and tried to quantify how much of those data are really not available, and they found an alarmingly high number. So they were looking at papers where authors had actually said they would provide the data if requested. So that's what they mean by a data availability statement. These authors have said, yes, the data are available. But when they went and asked for those data, 93% of authors either didn't respond at all or declined to share. So that is a huge chunk, especially coming from folks who supposedly are inclined to share. So really a problem with a lack of access. And as we saw with open access, this is not just an abstract problem. People are using open data to solve real world problems. So these are just a few examples that I think are particularly relevant to some of the challenges that we're facing today. So you can see the first one at the top left there. This is an organization that is using open ocean data and data on climate change to help spur reforms, right? Another one there in the bottom left, folks using open genome data to protect vulnerable species that might be at risk of extinction, especially in certain areas of the globe. Another one that is a huge health problem today, antibiotic resistance. So we can see there on the right, there's a data sharing initiative that is using that open data to try to help fight against antibiotic resistance. And then finally, this last one on the right was a really interesting challenge put together where they encouraged students to use open data that NASA had provided to try to figure out solutions for mitigating or reducing disaster risk in Central America. So all of these are really just concrete examples of how data can be used to various benefits, societal benefits. And these are a couple of other examples, but particularly in the realm of decision making. And I'm going to actually read from a few notes here because I do want to make sure I get this right. So the one on the left here, the USDA embarked on this journey with a founding partner at the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition Initiative, so GODAN. And they are promoting kind of the proactive sharing of open data to make information about agriculture and nutrition available, accessible, and usable worldwide, particularly thinking that this open data can help farmers and consumers make better decisions. And then the one on the right here is an example of how two particular cities, Rio in Brazil and Chicago in the US, are using, again, NASA open data, so Earth observations, to map, monitor, and forecast water and air quality, urban heat island effects, landslide risks, and more. And those, of course, have a direct impact on their communities. There's this really interesting project that tries to capture some of this. It's called the Open Data Impact Map. So this is not academic organizations. This is specifically a database of organizations, social organizations, government organizations that are using open data for direct societal impact. As you can see there, they have over 90 countries with different initiatives and over 1,600 organizations that are using open data in different ways. So we've just collected a few examples on the next slide that come from that map. And I tried to pull ones that would be kind of relevant to the policy realm. So if you see this one, the Energy and Resources Institute, this is an organization based in India, and they are using open data to help make recommendations, particularly on environmental policy. The one in the middle here, Center for Governance and Accountability, that's an organization based in Pakistan. And they're using open data to inform citizens about governance issues and hopefully strengthen responses to citizen grievances. And then finally, this one on the right is the Lebanese Association for Democratic Elections, and they're using open data to promote electoral transparency and election reform. So again, really concrete examples of how open data can be used, not just in the real world, but specifically in a policy realm. And I think, especially some of those ones where we saw they're working to address citizen grievances, working to get folks engaged in election and election reform, really highlights one of the benefits we were talking about, and I think is reinforced here even more. And that is that open research and open science helps kind of build that public engagement and public trust. So these are just a few examples we've pulled where folks are creating software for citizen science. So this is citizen science. We mean, folks in the community actually getting involved in scientific projects, helping collect data or helping analyze data in creative ways. There's also examples here of data sharing in the context of community engaged partnerships. So if you're going to engage with that community, there should be a reciprocal relationship there. And then that, of course, helping to strengthen the public trust in science. We know that that is a growing issue, right? There's a lot of misinformation in the world. People don't necessarily understand the results that are coming out of certain studies. So the more that we can be transparent with those results, the better public trust we can build and strengthen those relationships. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Greg to talk about some more of the organizations in the world that are really leaning into open research for all the good reasons that we've tried to outline here.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. And this is, one of the key points we want to impress upon folks is this idea of sharing access to the literature, sharing access to the data as a means to improve the efficiency of and the trust in public policy. It's really a growing global trend, growing global cross-sector trend, right? So we know, well, one of the things in the United States, in August of 2022, the Office of Science and Technology Policy passed or issued a memorandum which had the effect of saying that all federally funded research, the papers and the data will need to be made publicly and openly available within the next 2 years or so. It's being phased in, but if you're getting federal money for your work, you're going to have to share it and share it openly. There are similar trends in quite literally dozens of countries. The European Union is heavily engaged in this as well. International organizations, we mentioned UNESCO, but also the World Health Organization are really leaning into the value of open science and the idea that access to knowledge really is a fundamental human right. There are lots of universities around the world. We chose two relatively randomly that are updating their policies in terms of how they hire and how they grant tenure and promotion to researchers and to scholars to make sure that open practices are incorporated within those incentive structures. Lots and lots of philanthropies, hundreds of philanthropies across the world, similar to what we're saying about the government, are saying, if you take our money, our expectation is you're going to share your work, and we're going to require that you do that. Within the disciplinary structure, there are professional societies ranging from anthropology to zoology that are leaning into this concept and saying, if you are an active researcher in our field, the norms and the good practices are that you make your work available. That's what it means to be a good actor in this subject area. And of course, libraries as sort of the conduit to knowledge have played a long-term integral role in making sure that once those policies are in place, that actual access is enabled. It's really neat. I mean, we see, there are NGOs that are of significant prominence that are engaged in this. So the World Bank, the WHO, which you mentioned, UNESCO, the G20, OECD. There are lots and lots of groups that have said it is fundamental to our mission to ensure that there is access to and engagement with the literature and with the data. That if we are going to do the things that we want to do, which are big, meaty, substantive policy areas, we need open access to the literature. We need open data in order to meet those goals. I mentioned, this idea of governments. We just wanted to give you a sense of there are a lot of governments from a lot of different regions. Erin and I just had the pleasure of co-hosting a workshop on open science in DC last month, and we had representatives from I think 31 different countries that were participating. It's really become a global phenomenon, and it's great to see that momentum really continue to grow. And just from the U.S. perspective, obviously, because I suspect most, if not all of you are U.S. based, this really is a game changer. The idea that the federal government has said, if you're getting grant support from any one of our 400 plus departments and agencies, we're going to expect that you make your work available. And what they've leaned into are some of the values that we've talked about here today, that in order to really maximize equity and engagement in science, in order to make sure we have a diversity of voices, in order to make sure that we are transparent in our methodology, in order to ensure that our policymaking is evidence-based. We need this work to be available to all, and some of that is about replication, right? So you make you run a study and you make a claim. Others should be able to test that, right? That leads to the question of scientific efficiency, which is if we can test the stuff and we can replicate it and we can identify positive directions versus dead ends, we're going to accelerate the pace of discovery, right? And so that's when we think about policymaking, that's part of this this challenge as well. I think I'll pass it back to Erin here. We're steaming towards a grand climax, and then we'll open it up for questions. But I'll turn it over to Erin for a slide or two.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Yeah, so Greg mentioned the numerous organizations, international organizations, national governments, the U.S. initiatives on open science. And so we just wanted to condense a little bit of that and talk about some of the overall global policy trends that we're seeing with respect to open science. So this first one, what we are seeing is a focus particularly on the two areas of open science that we've talked about today. So open access or article sharing and open data or data sharing. So those seem to be the top priorities, and that does make sense in terms of providing that access to information. But we're also seeing increasing support for other practices like preprinting, which refers to sharing a version of your article before it's formally published in a journal and potentially getting some early feedback, and also code and software sharing. So really a diversity of practices that are getting included in those open science policies. We're also seeing a move away from embargoes. So many of these early policies that we saw maybe 10 years ago did allow for up to 12 months, for example, for researchers to share their articles or data. We're seeing a move away from that with a recognition that the earlier we can get access to that information, the more impact it can have in terms of building upon it, or as Greg was talking about the Ebola example, responding in real time to particular crises or outbreaks and things like that. So yes, a focus again on that immediate and early access to information. Also seeing a recognition of author rights. So that's been something that has been an issue. A lot of these journals that Greg was talking about required authors to sign over their rights. And at that point, authors had no more involvement in the decision-making process in terms of how that information was shared. And so was shared. So now we're seeing a return to that recognition that authors need to be involved in the process of deciding how and when their work is shared. Recognition of certain models. So, as we saw a move to open access, it has in some journals taken the form of an author pays model. But as we can imagine, that is not really an equitable solution, especially for many researchers working in low and middle income countries who don't have the resources to pay for that. And searching for those more equitable solutions that will allow researchers to share at no cost. And then finally, a realization that with all of this, if we're going to make open science happen, we really do need better incentives that encourage researchers to share. So not just mandates, not just the sticks, for example, but also the carrots that say this is something we value as an institution, as a funder, et cetera, and it's something we'd like researchers to do. So I think with that, we can kind of close on two pieces. What can you do? And then how can we help? So this first piece, what can you do? So As you engage in your policy work, we'd really encourage all of you to think about the different communities and audiences you want to reach. And related to that, are there specific modes of communication and materials that will best resonate, right? So that might not always be a formal journal article. It might be a white paper. It might be a blog.
Nope. Erin, you went on mute. Yeah.
Yep. Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. So again, modes of communication, the best mode of communication might differ by community and audience. So we would really just encourage you to think about what those modes of communication are and how you can give kind of the largest number of people or the largest portion of that community access to digestible information. We'd encourage you, as you are creating work, that again could include journal articles, but also white papers, blog posts, data, podcasts. We'd encourage you to make all of that work openly available. And then also encourage your networks to do the same and help them see how this aligns with and enables their mission. I think there really is a strong peer-to-peer component here. It's not just folks coming in top down and saying this is something you need to do, but peers telling peers that this is something that has facilitated their work or enabled key missions, I think is a really powerful message. And how can we help? There are a few different ways. So if you and your networks are thinking about making your work open, let's have a conversation. Greg and I, we love to geek out on this stuff. We are happy to jump on a call anytime to talk open science. If you have questions about what this means for you, what this means in practice, different platforms you can share through, different licenses you can use to make your work open and reusable, we're happy to have any and all of those conversations. We can also provide some resources. So we do have kind of a collection of articles, evidence, case studies, examples, some of which we share today, that can help you argue the why, or also tutorials that can help explain the how of how to do this. And that can be especially, again, helpful if you're going to your peers or your networks and saying, this is something we should do. We can provide evidence to kind of back up that claim. We have particularly been working with a group of civic science fellows. So these are, again, folks that are really interested in getting communities involved in the process of science. And as we've been working with them, we've developed some project management tools and other resources that are helping them figure out how to reach their communities and how to share their work. So we would be happy to share those tools and resources with all of you. And then again, happy to answer any questions by email, jump on calls. This is something that we really love to do and promote. And so we're here to talk to any and everyone who has an interest in open science. And I think with that, we'll open it up for questions and just see how we can help all of you. Thank you.
Great. That was awesome. While people are thinking of questions, pop online, put it in the chat. We have Kaylin that are you able to ask your question live, Kaylin?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so my question is, do you think a kind of backwards approach of encouraging researchers to actually use open data in their research could help kind of speed up the process of getting researchers to actually share their data? Because I know it doesn't really seem like researchers are encouraged to use the data that's already out there. Everything is focused on collecting new data.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm looking. I'll call up the URL after we're done. But there are a number of prizes that have been advanced in the last few years that are about using open data. So here, I think this is called DataWorks, and I'll put it in the chat. I think this is the right one, but if it's the complete opposite, I apologize. I think it's right. But it's the NIH and FASIB, which is the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology. And the idea is, can we use open data? Again, I'll make sure that this is right. But can we use open data to advance science, and can we rely on that to provide some interesting novel findings? Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think pushing from both ends really does matter, right? To say, we want you to make your work available because we think it advances science, and we want you to use open data to show how that works in practice. You've identified something which is quite useful, which is being able to show the world this is not just theoretical, but actually, if you make your data available, good things are going to happen, and we can prove it. Those types of sort of showcases tend to accelerate adoption and trends in a way that's quite positive.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Greg said. We have another project that we're kind of just launching as well, where we're trying to encourage faculty to reuse data in their classroom. So use open data and have their students reanalyze the data. And what we're hoping is that by seeing the effect that open data can have in the classroom and the positive impact it can have on students, they're encouraged to share their own data. We'll see if that happens in practice, but again, it's something that we're hoping to see. And I think presenting it in an educational environment too is a little bit less threatening than asking them to kind of share their research data off the bat. So we're hoping there's a way to get to more faculty in that way.
There's another question, Cassandra. Do you want to read that, or do you want me to read it out? I can.
It's on to you.
Okay, so the question of what would it look like to not have an author-pay system of scientific articles? Are there mechanisms to change the pay structure of journals? Is there a cheaper way to do it? What's absolutely true is there are thousands and thousands of journals around the world that are not subscription-based and don't charge article processing charges. It's actually not particularly unusual in places outside of North America and Europe. Two models that are worth mentioning. One is called Diamond Open Access, and I'll put a link in here in the chat that's useful. And this is the idea that through a variety of mechanisms, institutional support or sponsorship, professional societies getting involved, that actually journals can be run if you're not trying to get a 40% profit margin, which the largest commercial publishers do in fact have a larger profit margin than Google or Disney or anyone else, that actually you can run journals fairly efficiently and without a huge amount of money. And so this Diamond Open Access project is designed to try and build sort of case studies and models that allow that to propagate through the system. There are other examples like Subscribe to Open, which is basically a collective action opportunity where libraries continue to pay for access, but if a certain number of libraries do this, it becomes free for everyone. This model is being tested. There are some, as you would imagine, some free rider considerations to think about, but it has some promise as well. So yes, the long-winded answer is there are lots of models that are in flight. Publishing does not have to be so expensive, and it does not have to have such high barriers either for readers or for authors.
That was sort of my question, and thinking even on the publishing side of getting reviewers, right? In large parts, these, paid for journals are still relying on, volunteer service from the reviewer side as well. And there's always sort of the conversation of like, should we pay reviewers? And then should we give them like strict deadlines and, a service fee if they, adhere to it, and they don't get the fee if they miss the deadlines. So it's a system that is available or ready for revision, seems like.
Yeah, it is, and it's not just about business models and sort of who's getting paid what. There's this idea that the current system is sort of the gold standard, but it's actually there are lots of inefficiencies that presumably need to be addressed. Not presumably, that do need to be addressed. This idea of peer review is great. There are, we talk about the 2,700 papers or whatever that get published every day. There's too much literature for it to be efficiently peer reviewed, and the system isn't designed for that. So there are other models. I'll just put a link in the chat. This is another sort of innovation, but the idea that maybe we can post preprints, and then once they're posted, they can be sort of curated and reviewed in a community way that allows information to be disseminated more rapidly, but also develops trust signals over time. I think there's a pressing need for more experimentation because the current models are not totally fit for purpose.
Yeah, Greg, and if I could just add really quickly to that, there is kind of a growing movement, again, going back to what can you do, to kind of have reviewers vote with their time, right? So if you have a journal that invites you to review, could you look at whether that journal is open access? What is their business model? How much are they involved with the community of researchers that they purport to kind of support? And so I think we do have power. If any of you are reviewing as well for your networks, we do kind of have a power in that sense to decide who we review for and who we don't. And that'll hopefully also spur some change.
Mm-hmm. We have a hand, Tessia.
Hi, yeah. Kind of just had a question on the US government's initiatives, I guess, in open research, and with the US federal initiatives that you mentioned, making strides in advancing open research. Where do you see I guess the greatest opportunities for growth and collaboration with US government institutions and global organizations when it comes to the future of open research?
Yeah, I can opine a little bit, and then I'm sure Erin has thoughts as well. But for this group, what I think is potentially impactful, an area where you're uniquely situated to contribute to this, is the federal government is doing this, right? They're saying you're taking our money, you're going to have to share your papers and data, and they've said the reason we want to do this, or the reasons we want to do this, improving equity, improving the evidence-based decision making, improving the pace of science, et cetera, and so forth. I think those are great reasons to enact this type of policy. It would be really useful to demonstrate to them anecdotally or with somewhat more rigor that it's having the intended effect, right? That by making federally funded research available, these things happened, right? And so to the extent that you're connecting policymakers to this available research and policy is happening as a consequence, finding ways that we can communicate that back to the OSTP, back to the White House, back to the individual agencies, that's really going to be useful. I know that they're starting to pivot to that question of how do we know that this has had the intended effect, and there's a role to be played there, I think, for folks in this network.
Yeah, plus one to all that. And I think just to kind of add, I think there's a way for these organizations to, on a meta level, to potentially formalize information sharing across those organizations. So some of them may be tracking some of this evidence of impact of their open science initiatives, but a lot of that stays in-house. And if there were really easy ways for, the NIH to share with the World Bank, or these kind of connections for them to share, here's the evidence that I've collected that this is having a positive impact, and then have that be a reciprocal relationship of kind of information sharing. I think that could be really impactful too. That could kind of speed up what are the lessons learned, where are we potentially going wrong or going right on policy, and how do we kind of change course faster if we see that that's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Francisco, your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Perfect. My question is another aspect of open access dissemination and other options for doing this that wasn't discussed as much are the existing systems for incentivizing scholarship and publication of research, especially within academic systems. And these systems translate to choices on where to publish because it impacts tenure, promotions, reputation, and many other career-changing things. And a notorious metric that's an example of this are the impact factors of journals, right? Which research has shown isn't actually really indicative of the impact of the research, but it drives so much of the decisions on where to publish, which I think also slows down our move towards more accessible open access efforts and movements. So I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are around this.
I think I'll take this one because you're speaking my language. So we've done a whole study actually on what do promotion and tenure documents say, and specifically how are they using the impact factor. And we saw, unfortunately, up to 40%, I think, of research intensive universities are still using the impact factor, despite the data you mentioned that we know it's not a dependable metric in terms of looking at things like actual quality of the research or actually community impact of the research. It's unfortunate that people continue to use that as a proxy. There are some great initiatives, and maybe Greg, if you can track down some of those links. So for example, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA, Helios, as Greg mentioned here, Quora. There are a number of initiatives that are focusing on responsible use of metrics. So if we're going to use metrics, let's use them in the right way and use them for things that they actually measure instead of using them as proxies for things that they really don't indicate. And then also, I think there is a movement through various initiatives of these that we also need to have qualitative indicators. We can't just rely exclusively on metrics. I'll say this is a very personal issue for me because I went through tenure and promotion a couple years ago, and faced all of these issues that my open science work wasn't really recognized. They were looking at the impact factors of the journals and counting publications and counting citations, and that was really frustrating to see. But I think on the flip side of that, we are seeing increasing recognition that that's a problem, and a lot of initiatives out there that are trying to change that. So I hope that, and projects that maybe, Greg, if you want to just allude to what Orca is doing in this space, we hope to have a positive impact there as well.
Yeah, so plus one to everything that Erin said. I will say that we've been involved in this world for a long time, and one of the things that we, at first it was, well, if funders voted with their pocketbooks, their checkbooks, and said, you're taking our money, you have to do these things, then the system would change. And we Erin and I built a funder network that had dozens and dozens of funders involved in this work, and it had some impact. And then it was, yeah, that's great, but it's actually it's at the governmental level. We need some signal for federal dollars because that's where the bulk of the money comes from. Sure, we decided to try and climb that mountain, and as a community, we had some impact, and ultimately the federal government did change their policies. And then of course it was, well, this idea of hiring and tenure promotion, really that's the thing you got to change if this is gonna, and all of them are true, right? You have to change all those things. I will say, without being too cryptic, we're we as Orca are very aware of that, and in months, not years, we'll be announcing something that is designed to tackle that head on. Because Francisca, you really hit on something important, which is, people perform work based on what gets rewarded, right? I mean, if someone says that, to get the money to support your work, you have to do this, or to get a job, you have to do this, you pay attention. And so as an organization, whether you're the US government or the Gates Foundation or, Stanford, if you say you value, openness, inclusivity, pace of discovery, reproducibility, you say you value those things, but your systems don't actually reward them, there's a terrible misalignment there. And so you're 100% right that we need to address that. Watch this space, tenure and promotion, we're coming for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great questions. We have a, oh, perfect.
Oh,
yes,
sorry.
please.
So I guess to go off of that question, how I mean, the way that these research projects and labs themselves are funded is based upon, like, I guess, topics that are hot at the moment. So, I mean, how can we as scientists, but also like, future policymakers, influence the funding organizations that are usually the federal government itself to start funding projects that are probably tackling diseases that are less common and that are just as equally, maybe not impacting greater large amount of people, but it's still would be very impactful for a few that are probably not represented or their diseases aren't getting enough attention.
Yeah, it's a really good question there, and I don't have a perfect answer. What I will say is there are organizations that are increasingly involved in sort of the long tail of that question. So Chan Zuckerberg Initiative has a Rare as One program, which is specifically focused on rare disease. The Health Research Alliance is doing some interesting work in that area as well. But it is it is a challenge, right? That money tends to cluster towards specific topics or specific trends. There are, in the private philanthropic sector, there are some initiatives that are designed specifically to try and provide a little bit of balance, but it's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, and like Greg said, I don't think I have a perfect answer either, but I'll say that one strategy that I think has worked for me is telling your story, right? So and that can be as little as like putting things on your CV that your institution has not asked about. I put on my data sets in my software, and I just kind of I don't care if you don't ask for it. I'm putting it on there anyway. And at some point you're going to have to look at it. I think also telling your story in narrative form, there are opportunities sometimes with funders to tell that story and to bring in people who've been directly impacted by your work. And I think when you can bring those people in front of folks and say, this is their story, this is how open science directly impacted them, that's really powerful. And I've seen that be a pretty effective strategy. And it can feel, I'll say it can feel frustrating, right, at first, because you kind of feel like nobody's listening to those stories. But I think if you just kind of keep plugging away and keep putting them in front of people, eventually I think people do listen.
Great questions. We have 5 minutes left. And I want to give Erin and Greg sort of the last floor. But one of the things that I want to highlight is that this is really important as you are in school or earlier in your career as well, because you guys are going to be driving these important questions of, what does it mean when I seek an opportunity at an organization? Do I publish anything that is closed off for $50 an article, right? You guys are in this position right now. And so I know as I've gotten closer, to understanding this and being involved, I've chosen to, publish it on my own website and publish it on my own LinkedIn, right? And I definitely do my best to give a more generic Gmail account when it's the author's correspondence, because I've changed organizations, right? And LinkedIn has made that more open and accessible as well. It's challenging sometimes to go back through the databases and be like, where is that data set? But that's made it more important for me to have those file folders organized and not just like all on my desktop, right? And not all in a folder that says desktop. And so I think that you guys, I really hope that you took away some of these highlights. And if nothing else, just this is National Science Policy Network, right? Connect with Erin and Greg. You may not be approaching it right now, but keep this in the back of your mind as you're advancing in your career. Stay connected and be like, you know what? I really do want the community to have this accessible. Yes, I have my big 100-page, lots of words, technical jargon, but how can I make just one little thing more accessible to the community? that I want to have a real world impact on. So keep it in the back of your head. It's really important stuff. And that's sort of why we asked for this conversation on the last day. So on the first day, we talked about just science policy and community in general. We moved our keynote speaker to Tuesday, and we spoke about sort of what's going on at a department level in the community of Massachusetts, as well as Long Beach and Allentown, and Metro Lab getting really, data into the hands of local policymakers. And then yesterday we talked about coalition building, right? We can't do it alone. How do we grow our community, and how do we get everyone sort of going on the same, swimming in the same lane, going on the same train? I don't know, whatever analogy works, all on the same team. And today it's really thinking about how important it is to get our communicate our science policy openly and inclusively and community participatory. So with that, I'm going to have Erin and Greg share if there's anything that this audience takes away today. What would you like it to be?
Oof, that's a tough one. But I think I'll follow up on what you said. So I started my open advocacy career 12 years ago when I was an early career researcher. And actually we had a conference kind of dedicated to that. And I think those folks then went out and had a huge impact in the world. And I would say that early career researchers have been one of the strongest advocates for open science. And one of the most effective groups, I think, in advocating for open science, because they really are experiencing some of those frustrations and those problems and lack of access in real time, and they want to share and they want to have an impact. And so I guess I just plus one what you said, that early career researchers can have a huge impact in this advocacy space. And I just encourage you to think about kind of what change you can make happen in your corner.
Yeah, and I'll just very quickly say, if you have the intention, the will, but you don't know how, there are lots and lots of people. There's a whole network that can help you. So start by asking us, and if we're not the right people, we can absolutely put you in touch. But you can do great things, and there's a network here to support you.
Great. Thank you so much to you, Erin and Greg. It's been important and insightful. Thank you so much. And to the rest of you, thank you for everyone that's come. Many of you guys have come from all 4 days. Thank you. You'll receive your certificates soon, and also a survey to ask you how it was and what we can do better in the future as genuine research scientists ourselves. We're always looking to improve. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day and a start of the weekend. Thank you so much.